For 22 years, one small family in a South London tower block made Britain laugh at everything the country secretly recognised in itself. They dreamed of becoming millionaires. They failed again and again. They kept trying anyway. At its peak, more than 24 million viewers watched them. It became one of the most loved comedies in British television history. But behind the laughter was something the audience felt without ever being told. The people who made Only Fools and Horses had known real hardship, class, poverty, illness, loss, and, in some cases, the long shadow of war. They had known what it was to lose a father, a brother, a home, a dream. They had known what it was to fail, quietly, for years, before anyone thought to notice them. And then, together, they made something that laughed at all of it, and made a country laugh with them. This is the story of the men and women behind the Trotters, and of why a comedy about failure became one of Britain's greatest stories of hope. John Sullivan was born on the 23rd of December 1946 in Balham, South London. He was born into the kind of home that television programmes did not, at that time, tend to notice. His father, John Patrick Sullivan, was an Irish-born plumber. His mother, Hilda, worked as an occasional cleaner. The family lived at 35 Zena Road, in a rented flat. Money was tight, ambition was small, prospects were smaller. At 15, he left school without qualifications, and for more than a decade, he worked a series of ordinary working-life jobs. He was a messenger. He sold second-hand cars. He worked in advertising, in brewery yards, in what employment forms of the time cheerfully called general duties. After years of ordinary work, Sullivan took a job at the BBC as a scene shifter, partly because it brought him closer to the world he wanted to enter. In spare moments, he kept writing sketches. He sent them to the producer Dennis Mayne Wilson. Wilson read them. Wilson bought them. He watched, without knowing it, the small South London world he would eventually put on television. Before Peckham became a television address, it had already lived for years inside John Sullivan's memory. He knew the rhythm of market talk, the half-boast, the half-lie, the way men with very little still performed confidence, because confidence was sometimes all they had left to sell. He had not needed to research working-class Britain. He was working-class Britain. The world he came from was not tragic. It was worse than tragic. It was ordinary, and ordinary in the Britain of the 1950s and 60s meant almost invisible. But Sullivan noticed something. He noticed the way market traders spoke. He noticed the way men leaned on the counter of the local pub and told each other stories that were not quite true. He noticed the way people who had almost nothing kept convincing themselves that this time next year, things would be different. He noticed the way the working class of South London laughed, and when, at the age of 27, he finally talked his way into a job at the BBC, he brought all of it with him. Sullivan wrote for Ronnie Barker on The Two Ronnies. He wrote Citizen Smith. He learned his craft. Citizen Smith, his sitcom about a self-styled Marxist revolutionary in Tooting, ran on the BBC for 4 years. It taught Sullivan how to build a show around a single character with a single dream. By the time he pitched Only Fools and Horses in 1981, he was not a beginner. He was already a comic writer who understood, in a way most British sitcoms of the period did not, that the joke could be gentle. And then, in 1981, he pitched a comedy about two brothers running dodgy market deals from a flat in Peckham. He called them the Trotters. He did not laugh at them. He laughed with them. And here is a quiet fact that matters. Every episode of Only Fools and Horses across 22 years was written by John Sullivan alone. There was no writer's room. There was no rotating team of gag hands. One man carried the voice of the Trotters for the full length of their fictional lives. That is why, across 64 episodes and 2 decades, the world never once lost itself. That was the difference. That was always the difference. Del Boy was funny because he exaggerated hope, but he was moving because the hope came from somewhere real. Sullivan understood aspiration from the inside, because for more than a decade, he had been the man who kept believing that next year might be different, in a life that had given him very little reason to believe it. Before the country loved Del Boy, John Sullivan had already understood him. David Jason was born David John White on the 2nd of February 1940 in Edmonton, North London. Britain was already at war, but the London Blitz had not yet begun. In that same delivery, David lost the twin brother he would never meet. Arthur White died at birth. It was the first loss of a life that would know several, but it was also, in a way, the beginning of a certain kind of understanding. He grew up knowing that the world could take, without warning, the things you had not even had time to hold. His father, Arthur, was a Billingsgate porter. His mother, Olwyn, was a Welsh charwoman. The house was crowded, money was scarce, and young David, bright, restless, unacademic, left school at 15 to train as an electrician. For years, he wired homes and small businesses by day and acted with amateur theatre companies by night. He was, by every measurable definition, a working man with a hobby. What nobody, including him, quite yet understood was that the hobby would eventually give him a national voice. His break came slowly. There were years of small parts. There were commercials. There was Do Not Adjust Your Set. There was Open All Hours as Granville, opposite Ronnie Barker. There was Porridge. There was a sharp intake of breath. There was a great deal of quiet, competent, patient work. And then, at the age of 41, David Jason was offered the part of Derek Trotter. Only Fools and Horses now feels impossible without David Jason. But Del Boy did not arrive on screen as an obvious inevitability. Jim Broadbent had been suggested. So had the actor N. Reitel. The producer Ray Butt had been circling several names. It was only after Butt watched Jason working with Ronnie Barker on Open All Hours that he understood what the part actually needed. Not a Cockney sharp, a man who could sell a bad idea and mean it. He almost said no. And what David Jason brought to Del Boy was not, in the end, what anyone had predicted. He gave him warmth. Del Boy could have been played as a sharp Cockney chancer, clever, cynical, hard-eyed. Jason played him as something else entirely, a man whose confidence was fragile, whose schemes were desperate, whose love for his younger brother was the one true thing in his life. Del Boy dreamed of becoming a millionaire because being poor had already broken too many people around him. Jason understood that. He had been one of those people himself. For 22 years, he carried the show. And along the way, life gave him further tests. His partner of 18 years, Muvanwi Talog, died of breast cancer in 1995. He had cared for her at the end. He was 55. He rarely spoke about it publicly. But what he brought to Del Boy was never bitterness. It was warmth. It was that strange, stubborn British belief that tomorrow could still come good. It was hope, learned the hard way. He would be knighted in 2005. Sir David Jason had earned it. If Sullivan wrote the dream, David Jason gave it a face. Nicholas Simon Lyndhurst was born on the 20th of April, 1961, in Emsworth, Hampshire. He was 20 years old when the BBC cast him as Rodney Trotter. He would play the part until he was 42. That, on its own, is a remarkable career fact, but it is not, in the end, why Rodney mattered. Rodney mattered because he was the character Britain watched grow up. When the show began, in 1981, Rodney was a lanky, uncertain 19-year-old who lived in his older brother's shadow. He was the perpetual younger sibling. He got the punchlines wrong. He was told over and over again that he was a plonker. He believed quietly that his brother might be right. But as the show went on, Rodney did what younger brothers actually do. He grew up. He got married. He got a job. He tried, and often failed, to become the man his brother had never quite been. And the audience, millions of them, week after week, grew up with him. By the time Rodney arrived in 1981, British audiences had already been watching Nicholas Lyndhurst on their screens for nearly a decade. He had played Adam Parkinson in Butterflies, the BBC comedy about a middle-class mother in an unhappy marriage. He had appeared in guest roles and small parts on regional television. He had been visible to viewers as a shy, slightly serious boy long before Only Fools and Horses. What the Trotters did was give him permission to keep growing publicly over 22 years without ever quite losing the boy underneath. But Rodney gave him something different. Rodney gave him 22 years. The Del Boy and Rodney relationship was the emotional engine of the show. The schemes, the pubs, the yellow van, the Peckham skyline, none of it worked without the two brothers at the center of it. Del Boy loved Rodney. Rodney loved Del Boy. The comedy was that they could almost never say so. Nicholas Lyndhurst played Rodney with a quiet, patient, deeply English kind of vulnerability. He allowed his character to be embarrassed. He allowed him to be disappointed, and he allowed him, slowly, over the course of a decade, to become his own man. In later life, Nicholas Lyndhurst would face a private grief that belongs first to his family. We will return to it, briefly and with respect, near the end of this story. Only Fools and Horses was funny because Del Boy kept dreaming. But it was moving because Rodney kept trying to grow. By the early 1980s, the Trotters were no longer just characters. To millions of viewers who tuned in each Sunday, that flat in Nelson Mandela House had begun to feel like a real home. Their poverty, their schemes, their small victories, their arguments over breakfast, the tea in the mug that never quite got drunk, the paperwork that never quite got filed, it had all become familiar. And familiar, on British television, is very close to family, which is why what happened next hurt so much. Lennard Pearce was born on the 31st of October, 1915, in Paddington, London. He was the youngest of 5 children. His father, Sidney Pearce, had already been killed in action during the First World War. He was raised by his widowed mother. He trained at RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And when the Second World War came, he served in the Entertainment's National Service Association, performing for troops. For the next 40 years, he was what actors call a jobbing man. He understudied Stanley Holloway in My Fair Lady. He appeared with Laurence Olivier. He played small parts on stage and screen. He was respected within the profession. He was almost entirely unknown outside it. Then, in 1981, at the age of 65, John Sullivan cast him as Grandad Trotter. And in the space of 3 years, Lennard Pearce became one of the most beloved older character actors in Britain. Grandad was the warmth of the Trotter home. He was the memory. He was the frailty. He wore his coat indoors. He watched television with the sound turned down. He said very little, and what he did say was often precisely the wrong thing at precisely the right moment. He was, quietly, the emotional foundation of a family in which nobody could ever quite say what they meant. By the autumn of 1984, Lennard Pearce was 69 years old. His health had been fragile for years. He was a heavy smoker. He had been living with high blood pressure. And in early December, he arrived at the Whittington Hospital in Highgate, having suffered a heart attack. John Sullivan visited him there. Pearce, weakened but conscious, was reassured that Grandad would not be written out of the show. Sullivan meant it. 3 days later, on the 15th of December, 1984, Lennard Pearce suffered a second heart attack. He died in hospital. The next morning, filming was due to resume. David Jason and Nicholas Lyndhurst were already in makeup when the producer, Ray Butt, walked in. He did not need to say much. They understood at once. Filming was cancelled. Pearce had already filmed material for a Series 4 episode called Hole in One. It was, painfully, a story about Grandad. When Pearce died, that footage could not simply be recycled. Sullivan now had 2 problems. The first was practical. How to complete a series of television with a leading cast member gone. The second was harder, and it was the one that would define the rest of the show. How do you acknowledge, on screen, the absence of a man that millions of viewers had already come to love as family? Sullivan spent Christmas rewriting. He produced 2 new scripts in a matter of weeks. One introduced a character who would help absorb the loss. The other, broadcast on the 25th of February, 1985, was called Strained Relations. It was Grandad's funeral. What made the decision unusual was not that an actor had died. Television has always lost people. It has always found ways to explain them away. A phone call, a written line, a quiet fade to another storyline. Only Fools and Horses did something more dangerous. It let the absence remain visible. The gap in the room became part of the story. It was a rare moment in British sitcom. Real loss was allowed to enter the fictional family, unpolished and unresolved. For many viewers, it was the first time Only Fools and Horses felt not just funny, but mortal. The laughter continued. But from that point on, Only Fools and Horses carried loss inside it. The show needed a new, older figure, and they found one in a bank manager who had, quietly, spent 40 years playing amateur theatre in the evenings. Buster Merryfield was born in Battersea, London, on the 27th of November, 1920. His father was a fitter. His mother was a waitress. His older sister Irene had died at the age of 8. He was raised in what was, by every measure of the time, a working-class London household, grieving, striving, and never quite comfortable. He was, from an early age, physically capable. In 1936, at 16, he became the British schoolboy boxing champion. 2 years later, on the 11th of July, 1938, he began a career at Westminster Bank. He would remain in banking for the next 40 years. Then the war came. He had served in the Royal Artillery as a commissioned officer. Later accounts describe him as involved in physical training and troop entertainment during the war years. But those are details that the historical record does not entirely lock down. What can be said with confidence is that he had been a young soldier of his generation. He had lived through the war. He had returned to civilian life. And he had, like millions of his contemporaries, gone back to work, quietly, without ceremony, and without much to say about what he had seen. He married Iris in 1942. They would have one daughter, Karen. He continued at Westminster Bank, which became National Westminster, then simply Nat West. He rose steadily. In April 1967, he was made manager of the Shepperton branch. Later, he ran the branch at Thames Ditton. In July 1978, he retired. He was 57 years old. He had spent his working life balancing ledgers, and in retirement, he did something extraordinary. He decided, at 57, to become an actor. For 7 years, he took whatever roles he could find. He did pantomime. He did regional theatre. He was cast as Baron Hardup in a production of Cinderella. And it was there, in a small provincial theatre, that a BBC scout saw him. He was 64 years old when he auditioned for Uncle Albert. The character was written to fill the gap left by Grandad's death. Albert Gladstone Trotter was a retired sailor, a Royal Navy veteran who could not, for the life of him, stop talking about the war. It was a comic device. Every scene, sooner or later, Albert would begin with the same 3 words. During the war. And the family would groan, and the audience would laugh, and the show would move on. But something quieter was happening underneath the joke, because Buster Merryfield himself belonged to that generation. He had actually been in the war. He had actually served. He had actually come home. He had actually lived through the long, silent post-war decades in which men of his kind rarely spoke of what they had been through. Except sometimes when a friend at the bar was tired, or a memory arrived without warning, and someone would say very quietly, "During the war." The younger part of the audience heard "during the war" as a Grandad-style running gag. It was funny because it was repetitive. It was funny because Uncle Albert would not stop. But an entire audience over 55 heard it differently. They had grown up with fathers and uncles and grandfathers who had said exactly that phrase, exactly that way, at exactly that pause in the conversation. The joke was for them, but the memory was for them too. The joke was that Uncle Albert could not stop remembering the war. The truth was that millions of people watching him had spent their lives trying not to. Buster Merryfield played the part for 14 years. He never quite spoke about his own service in public. He was a lifelong non-drinker and non-smoker. He was, in almost every measurable way, the opposite of his character. And yet nobody in Britain played Uncle Albert as convincingly, because nobody in Britain understood the joke the way he did. The contrast between actor and character was not a small one. Uncle Albert was chaotic, loud, indiscriminate with his memories. Merryfield had spent 40 years balancing bank ledgers to the penny. He was disciplined. He was punctual. He was quietly serious in company, but it was that very discipline, the discipline of a man from a generation that had learned when to remain quiet, that gave Uncle Albert the strange dignity underneath the comic device. He was funny because Buster Merryfield understood from the inside exactly what the joke was about. He died on the 23rd of June, 1999, in Poole General Hospital of a brain tumor. He was 78. His character's death was written into the show 2 years later. Only fools and horses understood something important. Sometimes the funniest people are the ones carrying the longest memories. Roger Lloyd Pack was born on the 8th of February 1944 in Islington, North London. His father, Charles Lloyd Pack, was a working actor of the pre-war and post-war British stage. His mother was a woman named Ulrika Elizabeth Poulet. She is described in biographical accounts as a Viennese Jewish refugee. Behind one of Peckham's quietest comic performances was a family history touched by the darker movement of 20th century Europe. His parents married in 1941. He was born 3 years later. He was educated at Bedale School in Hampshire, and then, like his father, at RADA. He acted for decades in an enormous variety of parts. He worked with the Royal Shakespeare Company. He worked in West End theatre. He was, by every standard the profession recognised, a serious actor, and then, in 1981, he was cast as Trigger. Trigger was, on the surface, the simplest character in the show. He was a road sweeper. He drank in the nag's head. He remembered nothing. Above all, he could not remember Rodney's name, a running joke he sustained across 22 years by calling Rodney, in every scene, Dave. Trigger was, on the surface, the simplest character in the show. He was a road sweeper. He drank in the nag's head. He remembered nothing. Above all, he could not remember Rodney's name, a running joke he sustained across 22 years by calling Rodney, in every scene, Dave. He was played with an almost weightless stillness. Roger Lloyd Pack understood that Trigger did not need to react. He simply existed, at the centre of the pub, unbothered by the world around him. He was the calm at the middle of the comic storm. Lloyd Pack was a private, thoughtful, quietly political man. He was a lifelong socialist. He campaigned for nuclear disarmament. He was a family man. His daughter, Emily Lloyd, became an actress of some note in her own right. He also appeared, over his long career, in The Vicar of Dibley, in Harry Potter, in Doctor Who, and in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. But it was Trigger who lived in the country's memory, and behind that stillness was a story of a Europe most of the audience preferred not to remember. Trigger made people laugh because he seemed untouched by the world. But like so much of Only Fools and Horses, the stillness on screen hid deeper histories of it. By the middle of the 1980s, Only Fools and Horses had grown from a modest sitcom into a national event. The scripts were sharper, the characters were richer. John Challis had joined as Boycie, the second-hand car dealer with the laugh that Britain would eventually learn to imitate. Sue Holderness had joined as Boycie's wife, Marlene. Tessa Peake-Jones would soon join as Raquel. Gwyneth Strong would come in as Cassandra, the woman Rodney married. The Trotter world was expanding. The nag's head was full. The yellow van was still failing to sell anyone anything of quality. And every Christmas, families across the country now gathered around their televisions for the Only Fools Christmas special. It had become a national ritual. By the mid-1980s, the Christmas Only Fools and Horses special had become a national event of a kind British television now barely remembers. Families arranged their evenings around it. Newspapers previewed it. And the show's language began, quietly and then everywhere, to enter ordinary English. Lovely jubbly. You plonker. This time next year. They were not sitcom lines any longer. They were things you might hear a stranger say in a queue at a bus stop, or a father say to a son who had disappointed him, or a market trader say to a customer who had asked one too many questions. Only Fools and Horses had begun to write itself into how the country spoke. The show won 3 BAFTAs for Best Comedy. It became, over successive years, one of the most awarded sitcoms in British television history. And then, on the 29th of December, 1996, came Time on Our Hands. It was the closing part of a 3-episode Christmas special. It was meant, at the time, to be the final episode. And in it, John Sullivan gave the country the ending that the country did not know it had been waiting for. Del Boy and Rodney, after 15 years of failed schemes, discovered that an old pocket watch they had been carting around for weeks was, in fact, a lost Georgian timepiece worth millions. They were millionaires at last. 24.3 million viewers watched them. It remains one of the most watched sitcom episodes in British television history. But the scale is not the point. The point is that Sullivan had spent 15 years teaching a country to hope for something it half suspected would never come, and the country had, in a strange way, hoped alongside them. When the payoff finally arrived, it did not feel like a punchline. It felt like a small, quiet vindication of everyone who had ever kept believing without evidence. But the moment that mattered was not the money. The moment that mattered came a few minutes later, when Del Boy, standing at the top of a hotel escalator, looked out over a horizon he had spent his whole life imagining, and quietly said what he had believed all along. "This time next year, we'll be millionaires." And this time, at last, they were. It was, for John Sullivan, the payoff of 2 decades of writing. It was, for David Jason, the payoff of half a lifetime of small parts and patient waiting. And it was, for millions of British viewers, a strange and unexpected national permission to believe that even the most unlikely people sometimes did, in the end, arrive somewhere. For families across Britain, Only Fools and Horses was not something they watched, it was something they gathered around. In 2004, it was voted Britain's best sitcom in a BBC poll of more than 340,000 viewers, and perhaps that is why the later losses felt personal, because by then, Peckham did not feel fictional anymore. The show ended in 2003. The Trotters at last said goodbye, and in the years that followed, the people who had made Only Fools and Horses began, one by one, to leave. John Sullivan died on the 22nd of April, 2011. He had contracted viral pneumonia. He had spent 6 weeks in a Surrey hospital. He was 64 years old. The plumber's son from Balham had, by the end, become one of Britain's most respected writers. His final television work reached viewers only days after his death. A quiet, painful footnote to a career built on giving ordinary lives extraordinary warmth. Roger Lloyd Pack died on the 16th of January, 2014, at his home in Kentish Town of pancreatic cancer. He was 69. His funeral was held at St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden, the church known to actors, for centuries, simply as the Actors' Church. His coffin arrived in a pink hearse, a small, private, slightly comic gesture from a man who had spent his professional life playing a road sweeper who could not remember his best friend's name. The funeral was attended by colleagues from across British television and theatre. John Challis, who had played Boycie for 22 years, died on the 17th of September, 2021. He had been diagnosed with cancer in 2019 and had been quietly ill for 2 years. He was 79. He was buried near his home in Herefordshire. His wife Carol was at his side at the end. His last major public project had been a documentary called Boycie in Belgrade, a small, warm tribute to a country that, on the other side of Europe, had always loved him almost as much as Britain did. There is a strange coda to John Challis's life that says something quiet about the whole show. In Serbia, from the 1990s onwards, Only Fools and Horses had become a national obsession. The country's public broadcaster had rerun it for years. Challis, in particular, was adored there. He was made an honorary Serbian citizen. In 2020, he made a documentary called Boycie in Belgrade to try to understand why viewers in a country that had known its own recent wars, its own difficult decades, had chosen this particular sitcom from Peckham as their favourite. The answer, when he found it, was almost too simple. Del Boy's schemes, his failures, his refusal to give in, none of that had needed a British passport to understand. Hope, he learned, translated. And, in September 2020, Nicholas Lyndhurst's son, Archie, died. He was 19 years old. It is not a story to dramatize here, only to acknowledge with respect. Only fools and horses gave Nicholas Lyndhurst the country's affection long before life gave him one of its cruelest tests. He has spoken of it only rarely. He does not talk about it publicly, and he does not need to. Buster Merryfield had gone earlier, in June 1999. Lennard Pearce had gone earlier still, back in 1984, before the show had even reached its peak. The people who had made Britain laugh, who had, week after week, gathered a nation into one small flat in Peckham, were, one after another, gone. And yet, strangely, the laughter had not gone with them. The strange thing about beloved comedy is that it does not really end when the actors leave us. It becomes part of how a country remembers itself. Only Fools and Horses lasted for 22 years. It ran for 64 episodes. It gave Britain some of the most watched moments in the history of British television. And then, one by one, the people who had made it began to leave. But the yellow van is still there. Del Boy is still promising, at the top of every escalator he ever meets, that this time next year they will be millionaires. Rodney is still trying to grow up. Grandad is still watching television with the sound turned down. Uncle Albert is still saying, quietly, during the war. Trigger is still calling Rodney Dave. They are still there because the country will not let them go. Del Boy never really needed to become a millionaire for the story to matter. The dream itself was the point. The believing was the point. The refusal to give up in a country that had, at various times over the 20th century, given so many people every reason to give up. That was the point. Only Fools and Horses lasted because it turned failure into hope. It gave a country the strange, stubborn permission to keep believing that things might come good in the end, even when nothing suggested they would. And that is why, long after the laughter first echoed from a fictional flat in Peckham, Britain still remembers the Trotters, not because they won, because they never stopped hoping. This has been Cinema Peak. If this documentary meant something to you, please consider subscribing for more stories from the golden age of British television.